Listen, the mainstream MMA media is going to tell you that UFC 327 was this incredible success story. Because Carlos Ulberg had an amazing comeback knockout. Because Josh Hokett and Curtis Blaydes put on a heavyweight classic. And yeah, the fights were fire. But what nobody's actually talking about, what's being completely buried under all that hype, is that the UFC just experienced a financial catastrophe, and the ripple effects are about to destroy the next event. Here's the reality that the algorithm is hiding from you. UFC 327 pulled in $6.5 million in gate revenue. That's not just low, that's historically, embarrassingly low. We're talking worst Miami gate in the entire modern era. This is a card that took place in Miami, a city that's become the UFC's financial powerhouse the last few years, and it brought in less than half what Sean O'Malley pulled in 2024 at the same venue. We're talking roughly 6,000 unsold tickets sitting empty in the arena. That's a massive problem. But here's the angle nobody's breaking down. Carlos Ulberg just had ACL surgery. The brand new light heavyweight champion who just won the title at UFC 327 is now out of commission indefinitely. So the UFC lost ticket sales on a weak card, and now they've lost their new champion to injury right when they need momentum the most. That's a double disaster. And it gets worse. UFC 328 is already struggling with ticket sales in Newark, with cheapest seats running near $400. Fans aren't buying because they're tired of getting priced out of events. The UFC has created a pricing crisis that's becoming impossible to recover from, and Khamzat Chimaev's event is going to suffer directly because of it. This is the story nobody's connecting yet, but it's absolutely crucial to understanding where the UFC stands right now. Look, the mainstream sports media is completely missing the real story behind what just happened at UFC 327, and that's exactly how you know this is the angle worth breaking down. Everyone's focused on the spectacular finishes, Carlos Ulberg's incredible comeback knockout over Jiri Prochazka, Josh Hokett and Curtis Blaydes putting on one of the most brutal heavyweight battles we've seen all year, and yeah, those fights were absolutely elite level. But when you actually look at the financial numbers behind this event, you're looking at something that's going to fundamentally change how the UFC operates for the rest of 2026. This isn't just a bad gate. This is a warning sign that the entire business model is starting to crack under the weight of unsustainable ticket pricing. UFC 327 took place at the Kaseya Center in Miami on April 11, 2026, and it pulled in $6,518,684 in total gate revenue. Now, on the surface, that number might sound substantial to people who don't follow combat sports business metrics. But when you compare it to what the UFC has been doing at the same venue in recent years, the decline is absolutely staggering. This is the worst performing numbered event in Miami since the UFC started making the city a regular destination in 2023. We're not talking about a slight dip here or a marginal decrease. We're talking about less than half, literally less than 50% of what Sean O'Malley pulled for UFC 299 at the same location just 2 years ago. That's a catastrophic collapse in revenue, and the numbers don't lie. What makes this even more significant is the attendance figure paired with the unsold tickets. The UFC announced an official attendance of 17,741 people, but former UFC champion Henry Cejudo, who was actually in attendance at the event, publicly stated that there were approximately 6,000 unsold tickets sitting empty in the Kaseya Center. Think about that for a second. The venue had thousands and thousands of available seats, and fans simply refused to buy them. This wasn't a sellout event. This wasn't a packed house with standing room only. This was an arena that was visibly not full, even though the fights on the card were genuinely exciting and competitive. The fundamental issue here comes down to pricing, and this is the angle that connects everything. Rising ticket prices have created a barrier that's becoming impossible for regular fans to overcome. The UFC has been steadily increasing the cost of admission across all their events, and it's finally reached a breaking point where fans are making a conscious decision to stay home rather than pay premium prices for live attendance. This is particularly damaging in Miami, which has historically been one of the promotion's most reliable revenue generators. If fans are rejecting Miami ticket prices, that tells you something serious about the overall health of the gate revenue situation across the entire promotion. What's particularly frustrating about this situation is that the UFC isn't even trying to hide their pricing strategy. They know exactly what they're doing. They're pushing ticket prices higher and higher because they believe the brand is strong enough to sustain it. But what UFC 327 demonstrated is that there's actually a ceiling to what fans will pay, and the promotion just hit it. The card didn't even have major star power driving sales. There was no Paddy Pimblett, no Sean O'Malley, no Conor McGregor, no heavyweight name that would justify premium pricing in the eyes of casual fans. So you had a situation where the UFC was charging premium prices for a card that didn't have the star-driven appeal to justify those costs. The comparison to other recent Miami events makes this even more clear. When you look at the gate numbers from earlier in 2026, you see UFC 324 pulling in $10.9 million, UFC 325 bringing in over $10 million, and UFC 326 managing $8.3 million. Then UFC 327 drops all the way down to $6.5 million. That's not a natural fluctuation. That's not normal variance. That's a direct result of fans rejecting the pricing structure, combined with the card lacking the marquee names necessary to drive premium sales. The UFC has created an environment where fans feel they're being overcharged. And that sentiment is now starting to impact revenue in measurable, quantifiable ways that Dana White and his team absolutely cannot ignore moving forward. This is where the story gets absolutely brutal for the UFC. And this is the angle that nobody's really connecting yet, because people are still celebrating the quality of the fights that happened at UFC 327. Carlos Ulberg just won the vacant light heavyweight championship in the most spectacular fashion possible. A dramatic comeback knockout against Jiří Procházka that will legitimately go down as one of the greatest championship finishes in recent memory. The crowd went absolutely insane. The replay value was perfect. Every metric suggested that Ulberg had just become the guy to build the division around going forward. But here's the devastating reality that came out after the event concluded. Carlos Ulberg had ACL surgery immediately following his championship victory, which means he's now facing an extended absence from competition. Let's be clear about what an ACL injury means in mixed martial arts. This isn't a minor setback. This isn't something that sidelines a fighter for a few weeks or even a few months. An ACL tear typically requires 6 to 9 months of rehabilitation minimum. And for a fighter like Ulberg, who just won the championship, the timeline becomes even more complicated because you can't just rush that recovery process. The light heavyweight division needs an active champion. The UFC needs an active champion. But instead, they just crowned a guy who's about to be unavailable for the better part of a year. That's a worst-case scenario for business continuity in the sport. Here's the strategic nightmare that the UFC is facing right now. They just had an event with historically poor ticket sales. And the one positive thing that came out of it, the new champion is now injured and unable to defend his title. This creates a cascading series of problems that's going to impact the promotion's ability to book events moving forward. Who are they going to build the next light heavyweight title fight around? Jiří Procházka just lost his comeback attempt after being sidelined for an extended period. The division doesn't have another obvious contender waiting in the wings. So now the UFC has to figure out how to keep the light heavyweight title relevant while the champion recovers from surgery, which typically means they either have to create an interim title situation or leave the division dormant for months at a time. The timing of this injury couldn't possibly be worse from a business perspective. The UFC had just suffered a significant gate revenue decline at UFC 327, which means the promotion needed the narrative of an exciting new champion to help drive ticket sales and interest for future events. Instead, they've got a champion who won't be competing for the better part of a year, which is essentially a dead division from a promotional standpoint. You can't market a division around a champion who isn't fighting. You can't build momentum for championship title fights when the champion is in surgery and rehabilitation. The UFC essentially just killed its own narrative momentum by having their new champion get injured in his championship-winning performance. What makes this situation even more complicated is how it reflects on the broader state of the light heavyweight division. This was supposed to be the title fight that helped revitalize a division that hasn't been producing consistent gate revenue or mainstream interest. Ulberg versus Procházka for a vacant title should have been a significant moment for the promotion. And it was. From a competitive standpoint, the fight itself was excellent. But from a business continuity standpoint, It's a complete disaster because the winner just immediately became unavailable for competition. The UFC now faces a difficult decision about how to proceed with the light heavyweight division. Do they immediately create an interim championship and have two other fighters compete for it while Ulberg recovers? Do they give Ulberg an extended absence and just put the division on hold? Do they rush Ulberg back to competition before he's fully recovered, which creates injury liability? None of these options are particularly appealing from a business perspective. They're all compromises that come with significant downside risk and limited upside potential. What this injury really demonstrates is how unpredictable combat sports can be from a business planning perspective. The UFC had specific expectations for what UFC 327 would accomplish in terms of building momentum for the light heavyweight division. Instead, they got a great fight and a terrible business outcome. The new champion is injured, ticket sales were historically weak, and the promotion is now facing uncertainty about how to proceed with one of their major title divisions. That's not the outcome anyone in the UFC front office was hoping for when they sanctioned this championship bout. Now here's where the domino effect becomes absolutely critical to understand. Because what happened at UFC 327 is directly going to impact the success or failure of UFC 328, which is scheduled to take place on May 9th in Newark, New Jersey at the Prudential Center. Khamzat Chimaev is defending his middleweight championship against Sean Strickland in what should theoretically be one of the most anticipated matchups on the entire UFC calendar. These two fighters have a long-running, bitter animosity with each other. The feud is genuine. The stakes are legitimate. The fight itself is genuinely compelling from a competitive standpoint, but ticket sales are already struggling significantly with more than 2 weeks still remaining before fight night. And that's a direct result of the pricing crisis that UFC 327 just exposed. The cheapest available ticket for UFC 328 is currently sitting at approximately $400, and that's not even a great seat. That's not close to the action. That's literally nosebleed section pricing for the worst seats in the venue. When you're charging $400 for the worst possible vantage point in an arena, you're essentially pricing out the majority of casual fans who might otherwise consider attending a live event. This is the exact same pricing structure that resulted in 6,000 unsold tickets at UFC 327, and the UFC appears to have learned absolutely nothing from that financial disaster. They're doubling down on the same strategy that just failed spectacularly at a venue that's historically been one of their most reliable revenue sources. What makes this situation particularly damaging is that the Khamzat vs. Strickland card is objectively strong on paper. This isn't a weak event struggling to justify premium pricing. The main event features two of the biggest names on the entire UFC roster. The card includes significant bouts of real consequence with fighters that fans actually care about. But even with a genuinely compelling fight card, fans are still rejecting the ticket prices, which tells you everything you need to know about where consumer sentiment stands right now. Fans aren't avoiding UFC 328 because the fights aren't interesting. They're avoiding it because they've reached a breaking point with pricing, and they're making a conscious decision that even premium fights aren't worth the cost of admission anymore. The pattern emerging across the entire TKO portfolio, which includes both UFC and WWE, shows that this isn't just an isolated UFC problem. WWE's WrestleMania 42 drew roughly 18,000 fewer fans over both nights compared to the previous year's edition at the same venue. Despite being in one of the most famous arenas in the world, rising ticket prices were cited as a major contributing factor, and the company had to quietly discount tickets heading into the event just to try to salvage attendance numbers. The pattern is consistent. The TKO Group has decided to maximize revenue per ticket by raising prices aggressively. But what they're discovering is that there's a ceiling to what fans will pay, and that ceiling is significantly lower than their financial projections anticipated. What's particularly concerning for UFC 328 is that Newark isn't even Miami. It's not a destination event in the same way that Miami has traditionally been. The Prudential Center is a solid venue, but it doesn't have the cachet of a beachfront Miami event that attracts tourists and international travelers. The UFC is expecting local fans to drive ticket sales in Newark, and local fans are the ones most likely to be price sensitive and most likely to make the decision to watch from home if pricing reaches an unreasonable threshold. That's a fundamentally different dynamic than Miami, where international tourism can help drive premium ticket sales even when pricing is elevated. The UFC is about to learn a painful lesson about market economics. You can't keep raising prices indefinitely without eventually hitting resistance from your consumer base. UFC 327 was that resistance point. The promotion had the perfect opportunity to adjust their pricing strategy and demonstrate that they understood the market feedback they just received. Instead, they appear to be implementing the exact same pricing structure for UFC 328, which suggests they either don't believe the UFC 327 numbers represent a real trend, or they're hoping that the Khamzat versus Strickland matchup is compelling enough to overcome the pricing barrier that fans just rejected at the previous event. That's a dangerous bet, and based on current ticket sales indicators, it appears to be a bet that the UFC is already losing. This is the moment where we have to actually talk about what's happening at the executive level of the UFC. Because what we're witnessing isn't just a couple of bad events or some temporary market fluctuation. What we're witnessing is the complete breakdown of a business strategy that's been driving UFC decision-making for the past several years. Dana White and the TKO Group made a calculated decision to aggressively raise ticket prices across all UFC events, operating under the assumption that brand loyalty would be strong enough to sustain those price increases indefinitely. They believed, and the financial projections probably supported this belief, that fans would continue paying premium prices because the UFC brand was too powerful to resist. But UFC 327 just proved that assumption dead wrong. And now the entire pricing model is collapsing in real time. The financial data tells the story clearly. When you compare the gate revenue progression throughout 2026, you can see exactly when the market started rejecting the pricing strategy. UFC 324 pulled in $10.9 million. UFC 325 brought in $10.1 million. UFC 326 managed $8.3 million. Then UFC 327 dropped to $6.5 million. That's not a gradual decline. That's not a slow erosion of interest. That's a cliff. That's fans hitting a psychological breaking point, where they collectively decided that the value proposition was no longer acceptable. And the worst part for the UFC is that this rejection came at one of their most reliable venues, in Miami, which has become the promotion's financial anchor in recent years. What makes this situation so critical for understanding the broader UFC business landscape is that it exposes a fundamental miscalculation in executive decision-making. The UFC operates in a unique position within sports entertainment because it doesn't have meaningful direct competition. There's no rival organization offering a comparable product at competitive pricing. So Dana White and his team likely concluded that they could raise prices aggressively without fans having alternative options. But what they missed is that fans have an even simpler option. They can just choose not to attend live events at all. The UFC can't compete with watching fights from home on television or streaming services, especially when live attendance prices reach levels that feel unreasonable to the average fan. The comparison to other sports and entertainment properties is instructive here. The NFL, which operates with a different business model and a much more established fan base, typically charges between $100 and $300 for regular season games, depending on the team and location. Premium playoff and Super Bowl pricing can reach higher levels, but those are special events with extraordinary demand. The UFC, by contrast, is now charging $400 for nosebleed seats at regular numbered events. That's not premium pricing for a championship event. That's standard pricing for a standard event, and fans have correctly identified that as unreasonable. What's particularly damaging about this pricing strategy collapse is the timing. The UFC had a perfect opportunity to demonstrate that they understand market realities and that they're willing to adjust their approach. Instead, they appear to be doubling down on the same strategy with UFC 328, which suggests either profound organizational arrogance or a complete disconnect between executive decision-making and actual market conditions. Neither option is particularly encouraging for the future of gate revenue at UFC events. The long-term implications of this pricing model collapse are genuinely serious. If fans have reached a breaking point at $6.5 million in gate revenue, if that's now the new baseline for how much revenue the UFC can expect from a major event in a major city, then the promotion's Financial forecasting for the next several years is now fundamentally wrong. Sponsorship deals, broadcast rights, negotiations, fighter purse structures, all of these things are likely built on financial projections that anticipated gate revenue significantly higher than what UFC 327 just delivered. If the UFC is now operating in a lower revenue environment, all of those calculations need to be adjusted downward. The really fascinating aspect of this situation is what happens next. Does the UFC acknowledge the market feedback and adjust pricing downward to try to rebuild attendance? Do they maintain current pricing and accept lower gate revenue as the new normal? Do they try some kind of hybrid approach with tiered pricing that offers lower-cost ticket options alongside premium pricing? The decisions made in the next 30 to 60 days are going to fundamentally shape the financial trajectory of the promotion for the rest of 2026 and potentially beyond. But based on what we've already seen with UFC 328 ticket pricing, it appears the promotion isn't yet ready to acknowledge that their pricing strategy requires significant adjustment. This is the moment where you need to understand what's actually happening behind the scenes at the UFC. Because the mainstream sports media is completely missing the real economic story while they're focused on individual fight highlights and fighter drama. The numbers don't lie. UFC 327 just pulled in the worst Miami gate in the modern era. Carlos Ulberg, the brand new champion, is now sidelined with ACL surgery, and UFC 328 is already struggling with ticket sales 2 weeks before fight night. This isn't coincidence. This is a systematic collapse of a business strategy that's been driving the promotion's decision-making. Dana White and the TKO Group are about to face a critical decision point on whether they're willing to acknowledge that their aggressive pricing strategy has hit a breaking point with fans. The data from UFC 327 is screaming that message loud and clear. Fans have rejected the price increases. They're choosing to stay home instead of paying $400 for nosebleed seats. They're done being treated like ATMs by a promotion that's operating under the assumption that brand loyalty will overcome market economics. That assumption just got shattered. What happens next is going to determine whether the UFC can recover from this pricing crisis, or whether they're headed toward a sustained period of lower gate revenue across all major events. Subscribe right now because this story is going to unfold over the next several weeks as UFC 328 ticket sales either improve or continue to struggle. Follow the gate numbers. Pay attention to how the UFC responds. Share this breakdown with anyone who cares about the business side of mixed martial arts, because this is where real consequences get determined, not in the octagon, but in the spreadsheets and revenue projections that drive executive decision-making. The algorithm is hiding this story, but you're hearing it here first.